Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Pound and I am back with another video from chapter 1.1, Introduction to Life Science from Purposeful Design Life Science. So our topic for today is going to be section 112, the characteristics of living things. How do we know something is alive? So our objectives are going to be to evaluate the concept of spontaneous generation and list the characteristics of living things. So spontaneous generation, you probably have not heard of this concept before, but this was a commonly believed concept. This is the theory that living things can develop from non-living things. So for example, we see this fungus and this moss growing on probably a log. And so people would have believed that the log or the soil itself or whatever it is on is what produced the living thing. They did not realize that living things have to come from other living things, that this fungus would come from another fungus, that the moss would come from other moss. There was a scientist named Reddy who showed that maggots do not grow from decaying meat because people, one thing they thought was that maggots grew from decaying material. They live on decaying meat because flies lay their eggs on the meat and the maggots hatch. The problem is they did not have microscopes at the time, so they could not see those eggs. And so they thought that the flies just came from the decaying material. Another thought was they thought that frogs either fell out of the sky with the rain because they came out when it rained, or they thought that they came up from the mud because they would see them coming up through the mud, so they thought that the mud produced them. So this was very common. But what Reddy did is he had meat in a jar and he let flies on it and saw that the flies laid maggots on it. Then he had another piece of meat in a jar that did not have flies on it, and he covered it with a barrier that the flies could not get through, and like a cheesecloth or something like their screen. And what he discovered is that there were magnets on top of the cheesecloth because the flies would congregate there and lay their eggs up on top of the cheesecloth, but could not get down to the meat. So he showed that the maggots came from flies, not from the meat. Another famous experiment that proved spontaneous generation was false was Louis Pasteur's. What he did is he created a flask with an S curve. It was called a swan neck flask on top of it, and he boiled some like broth. Okay, because broth, if you leave it out, will grow bacteria because bacteria from the air will get into it and start to grow. Well, with this swan neck, what happened is the microorganisms, the bacteria, whatever those microorganisms are, could not travel through that neck very easily, so they did not grow in the flask. They didn't grow in the flask until he broke the neck off so that they could more easily get in there with the air. Now let's take a look at the characteristics of living things. And some of these characteristics you will find that not only living things can have these characteristics, but you could make the argument that some non-living things have these characteristics as well. And in fact, we're going to do that in class. We're going to take a look at non-living things and even try to argue that perhaps they are living. So the first characteristics that all living things share are all living things are made of cells, the building blocks of life. And you can see in the background here are some plant cells, okay? And we're going to be taking a closer look at cells in class when we study them. All living things reproduce, and they reproduce after their own kind. So penguins will produce penguins, okay? They won't, say, produce a lizard. Okay, so all living things reproduce, and they reproduce after their own kind. All living things reproduce, and there are two types of reproduction. There's sexual reproduction, which is a form of reproduction in which offspring arise from two parents. And there is asexual reproduction, a form of reproduction in which offspring arise from a single parent. Now, with sexual reproduction, you get a lot of variety, okay? That's why in this room, we all look different, okay? Because that's the type of reproduction that God designed for humans. Asexual reproduction is all basically clones. Everything looks alike because there is only one parent. And so this is when we start cloning things, and this is common in a lot of plants like strawberry plants. Also, all living things grow and develop, okay, like this monarch butterfly caterpillar. This caterpillar will grow and develop into a butterfly, and there's a variety of ways that living things grow and develop. Some go through metamorphosis, like the butterfly. Other things, like ourselves, just gradually become larger. All living things respond to their environment. And what they respond to are stimuli. For example, that deer had perky ears because maybe they heard something like a whistle in the background and they were responding to that stimulus. So another example is we blink when something comes toward our eyes to keep them safe. Animals run from predators to keep safe, and plants grow toward light to photosynthesize. Also, all things use energy, and ultimately, all of that energy comes from the sun. Okay, that energy is trapped by plants during photosynthesis, becomes food for other organisms. Also, living things undergo metabolism. These are all the chemical activities taking place in an organism. Um, we usually use it to describe how quickly we digest food. That is not true. It's anything chemically that is taking place in us. In fact, I like to tell students that we're giant test tubes. Another thing is digestion, breaking down food into simpler substances that can be absorbed, that can be used for metabolism, basically. So we can see here a cow eating. We digest food, we eat, we digest it, we break it down. Also, respiration, using gases to produce energy. That's the reason we breathe in oxygen, because oxygen is used by respiration to provide us with energy. And we'll talk about that whole process and where it occurs in our bodies. Also, excretion, getting rid of unneeded materials. Actually, we excrete in a couple of ways. We actually excrete through our lungs. We give off waste there. We excrete through our skin by sweating. Okay. We excrete by urinating. And actually, feces are not excretion. That is what we call elimination. So that is not quite the same. That is a different word. That is elimination, just so you know. And we do all of this to maintain homeostasis. This is the ability to maintain a stable internal environment. So all of our life processes maintain homeostasis. If we get out of homeostasis, then there is disease present, okay? So if somebody has a disease, it's because their homeostasis is off. So our objectives today were to evaluate the concept of spontaneous generation and list the characteristics of living things. Now, don't forget your 5 questions for this video, and also keep watching the video so that you answer the questions at the end.